The golden light of autumn painted the black hills in fiery hues as Rebecca Miller knelt in her garden, harvesting the last of the season's herbs before the first frost. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, separating yarrow from echinacea, bundling sage and sweetgrass with twine. A cool breeze rustled through the pines surrounding her homestead, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant smoke of cooking fires. Rebecca paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand as her gaze drifted across the rolling landscape of Pine Ridge Valley. The hills were ablaze with autumn colors, a breathtaking vista that still managed to stir something in her heart, despite 5 difficult years alone on this frontier. 5 years of solitude had honed Rebecca's senses to the subtle rhythms of the land. Most folks in Riverdale dismissed her caution as the anxious nature of a woman living alone, but Rebecca understood the language of the wilderness in ways they never would. In this contested territory, where tensions between settlers and the Lakota simmered like a pot, ready to boil over, survival depended on reading the signs others missed. As she gathered her harvest into a worn basket, her attention was drawn to a flicker of movement along the tree line where her property met the dense forest. Something, or someone, had disturbed the usual pattern of shadows and light. Her hand instinctively drifted toward the knife sheathed at her belt, a habit born of necessity rather than fear. The blade had been Thomas's final gift to her, before pneumonia claimed him during their second winter on the homestead. "Trust your instincts, Becky," he'd told her, as fever brightened his eyes. "They'll never lead you astray." Now those instincts told her to watch and wait as the day's light began its slow retreat behind the western ridges. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca's vigilance was rewarded when the movement came again. More deliberate this time, a shadow detaching itself from the forest's edge, only to disappear behind the ancient oak marking her property's boundary. Not a deer or elk whose movements she knew as well as her own. This was something else entirely. She rose slowly, basket in one hand, the other remaining close to her knife, as she made her way back to the cabin, taking an indirect route that allowed her to scan her surroundings without appearing alarmed. The homestead that Rebecca had maintained against all odds stood as testament to her determination. The modest cabin with its stone chimney, the well-tended garden, the small barn housing her 2 horses and milk cow, all of it represented countless hours of backbreaking labor performed by hands that had once been more accustomed to playing the piano in her father's Boston home than wielding an axe or a plow. The porch that Thomas had built their first summer wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin, offering views of both the valley and the forested hills beyond. It was here that Rebecca paused, ostensibly to brush soil from her skirts, while her eyes carefully surveyed the tree line once more. Inside, she moved with practiced efficiency, hanging the herbs from the rafters where they would dry properly, checking that the stew simmering on the hearth hadn't scorched, and finally retrieving the Winchester rifle from its place above the mantel. The weapon was clean and loaded, as it was every evening before sunset. Rebecca had learned that particular lesson during her first year alone, when a desperate drifter had mistaken a widow's homestead for easy pickings. He'd left with a bullet graze across his shoulder and a newfound respect for women living on the frontier. As dusk settled over Pine Ridge Valley, Rebecca completed her evening routine with deliberate calm, lighting oil lamps, securing the livestock in the barn, and checking that water buckets were full in case of fire. All the while, her senses remained attuned to the world beyond her cabin walls. The crickets had fallen silent near the western corner of her property, another sign that something or someone had disturbed the natural order. Rather than betraying her awareness by peering into the gathering darkness, Rebecca went about her evening as though nothing were amiss. She ate her simple supper at the small table by the window, read several pages from the dog-eared copy of Little Women that had been her mother's, and finally began preparing for bed. Only then, with lamps extinguished and the cabin appearing settled for the night, did she silently position herself by the window overlooking the approach to her home, rifle resting comfortably in her hands. The harvest moon rose full and bright over the eastern hills, bathing the landscape in silvery light that transformed the familiar into something ethereal. An hour passed as Rebecca maintained her vigil, patience being another virtue the frontier had instilled in her. When the movement finally came, it was not from the forest's edge as she had expected, but from the shadow of her own barn. A figure emerged, hunched and unsteady, one hand pressed against its side. Even in the moonlight, Rebecca could see the dark stain spreading between the fingers, blood, fresh and flowing freely. The figure staggered several steps before collapsing near the well, a heap of buckskin and raven hair that lay motionless. In the moonlight, Rebecca hesitated only briefly. 5 years ago, she might have barred her door and waited for morning, fearful of the wounded stranger who had appeared on her land. But the woman who had survived alone on this homestead was made of sterner stuff, tempered by both loss and necessity. With rifle in hand, she slipped out the cabin's rear door, circling wide to approach the fallen figure from an angle that would allow quick retreat if needed. The man lay face down, his breathing shallow and labored. Long black hair spilled across the ground, partially obscuring features that Rebecca recognized immediately as Lakota. His buckskin shirt was torn and bloodied, and a crude bandage had slipped from a wound in his side, revealing an ugly gash that would prove fatal without proper attention. In that moment, Rebecca faced the first of many decisions that would alter the course of her life. The tensions between settlers and the Lakota had escalated dramatically in recent months. Bounty hunters roamed the territory, ostensibly pursuing hostiles, but often making little distinction between peaceful natives and those who had taken up arms against encroachment on their lands. Harboring a wounded Lakota would be seen as nothing short of treason by many in Riverdale. Yet as she knelt beside the unconscious man, Rebecca saw not an enemy, but a human being whose life hung in the balance. With a decisiveness born of countless frontier crises, she set her rifle aside and gently turned him over to better assess his injuries. His face, despite being contorted in pain, held a dignity that struck Rebecca immediately. High cheekbones, a strong jaw now slack with unconsciousness, and intricate braids woven with feathers and beads that marked him as someone of importance among his people. Around his neck hung a small medicine pouch, and beside it, partially concealed by his shirt, what appeared to be a military scout's whistle, the kind issued to Native Americans who served as guides for the army. A scout, Rebecca murmured, understanding dawning. The Lakota scouts walked a precarious line between two worlds, often trusted by neither. This man's presence on her land, wounded and alone, suggested he had fallen afoul of one side or both. His eyes snapped open suddenly, dark and alert, despite his weakened state. He instinctively reached for a knife at his belt, but lacked the strength to draw it. Rebecca remained still, meeting his gaze steadily. "I mean you no harm," she said clearly, keeping her hands visible. "You're wounded and need help." The man studied her with wary intensity before responding in accented but clear English. Why would a white woman help Lakota? It was a fair question, one that demanded an honest answer. "Because you need it," Rebecca replied simply, "and because I judge men by their actions, not by stories others tell about them." Something shifted in his expression, not trust exactly, but perhaps a willingness to accept the help his body desperately needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "I am called Wanbli," he said, the effort of speaking clearly taxing his remaining strength. "I'm Rebecca Miller. Can you walk if I help you? We need to get you inside before anyone else sees you." With considerable effort and Rebecca's support, Wanbli managed to rise to his feet. The journey of 30 yards to the cabin might as well have been 30 miles, each step an agony as blood continued to seep from his wound. By the time they reached the door, his face had taken on an ashen quality that Rebecca recognized as the precursor to collapse. Once inside, she guided him to the small bedroom off the main living area, Thomas's sick room during his final days, and now her own. The irony of placing a Lakota warrior in the bed of a frontier settler wasn't lost on Rebecca, but practicality overrode any such considerations. The room could be kept warm, was easily defended, and most importantly, had no windows visible from the main trail. "I need to treat your wound," she said, lighting a small lamp and gathering supplies from the trunk where she kept her medicines. "How did this happen?" Wanbli's breathing had grown more labored, but his eyes remained alert, assessing both Rebecca and his surroundings with the habitual caution of one accustomed to danger. "Bounty hunters," he replied after a moment. "4 men, led by one called Hayes. They attacked our hunting party 3 days ago. I escaped but took knife wound. Have been hiding, moving only at night." Rebecca's hands stilled momentarily. Ethan. Hayes was well known in Riverdale, a former Confederate soldier who had come west after the war, with bitterness and hatred burning in his heart. He had established himself as a bounty hunter, specializing in tracking down natives deemed hostile by territorial authorities. Though Rebecca had heard whispers that Hayes made little distinction between combatants and peaceful tribal members. When collecting his rewards, "You're a scout for the army?" she asked, noticing again the whistle partially concealed beneath his buckskin shirt. A flash of something crossed Wanbli's face, surprised perhaps that she had noticed this detail. "Was scout for Colonel Williams at Fort Harrison," he confirmed, "until Hayes and others said Lakota scouts give information to our own people, that we cannot be trusted." As Rebecca cleaned the wound, a deep knife slash that had thankfully missed vital organs, but had become infected during Wanbli's days of desperate flight, he shared more of his story in short, pain-filled sentences. The hunting party had been attacked without warning or provocation. 2 of his companions had been killed immediately. Wanbli had fought back, wounding one of the bounty hunters before escaping into forest terrain too difficult for horsemen to navigate. For 3 days, he had evaded pursuit, moving only at night while searching for a way to reach either his people's encampment at Thunder Basin or Fort Harrison, where Colonel Williams might offer protection. "Why not go directly to your people?" Rebecca asked as she applied a poultice of yarrow and other herbs to draw out the infection. "Too far. Too many hunters between here and Thunder Basin," Wanbli explained, wincing as she worked. "And I carry this." With considerable effort, he reached beneath his shirt and withdrew a folded oilskin packet. His hand trembled slightly as he offered it to Rebecca. "What is it?" she asked, taking the packet but not opening it. "Proof," Wanbli said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper as exhaustion began to overtake him. "Hayes and others kill Lakota for bounties, but not just hostiles. Peaceful ones too. Women, children. Take scalps to territorial office, claim they are warriors." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. "How did you get this proof?" "Was with Colonel Williams when bounty claim came. Hayes did not know I could read white man's writing, saw names, dates, took ledger page when no one looking. Colonel Williams was going to send me with letter to governor, but Hayes found out. That is when attack happened." The implications were staggering. If what Wanbli said was true, Ethan Hayes and his men were deliberately murdering innocent Lakota. including women and children, then claiming bounties intended only for proven hostile warriors. The territorial governor had established the bounty system as a reluctant compromise with settlers demanding protection, but with strict guidelines about who qualified as a legitimate target. Hayes had apparently found a way to turn tragedy into a profit. Rebecca carefully refolded the oilskin packet without examining its contents. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess without deliberate choice. Instead, she focused on completing her treatment of Wanbley's wound, binding it with clean linen after applying the poultice. "You need rest and time to heal," she said. As she worked, "The infection must be drawn out before you can travel again." Wanbley's eyes were growing heavy. The combination of exhaustion, pain, and the sedative effects of the herbs Rebecca had given him finally overwhelming even his warriors. "Discipline. Not safe for you," he murmured, fighting to remain conscious. "If Hayes follows trail, we'll face that if it happens," Rebecca replied with more confidence than she felt. "For now, sleep. You're safe here." As Wanbley finally surrendered to exhaustion, Rebecca gathered her medical supplies and quietly left the room. In the main living area of the cabin, she sank into the rocking chair by the hearth, the enormity of what she had done and what still lay ahead, settling over her like a physical weight. She had taken a wounded Lakota into her home, in a territory where many considered the native population to be enemies at best and subhuman at worst. If Ethan Hayes and his bounty hunters were indeed tracking Wanbley, her homestead might soon face a threat more dangerous than any she had encountered in her 5 years on the frontier. And if the document Wanbley carried truly contained evidence of Hayes's crimes, she had just placed herself at the center of a conflict with implications far beyond Pine Ridge Valley. Thomas's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows of the cabin. They had built together. "Trust your instincts, Becky." She had done exactly that, acting from the core principles that had guided her life, even when society's expectations pushed in the opposite direction. Now all that remained was to follow those principles wherever they might lead, regardless of the cost. As the fire burned low in the hearth, Rebecca made her plans. The root cellar beneath the kitchen floor offered a hiding place should anyone come searching. It had been Thomas's idea, a precaution during the early days when raids were more common. There were supplies enough to tend Wanbley's wound for several days, by which time he might be strong enough to travel to Fort Harrison, where this Colonel Williams could provide protection and ensure the evidence reached the territorial governor. What Rebecca could not have anticipated as she finally sought her own rest on a pallet near the hearth was how quickly these careful plans would unravel in the harsh light of the frontier morning. Dawn broke clear and cold over Pine Ridge Valley, the kind of crystalline autumn day that showcased the territory's wild beauty. Rebecca rose before first light, her body accustomed to the rhythms of frontier life. She checked on Wanbley, who slept fitfully, fever still evident in his flushed skin, though his breathing seemed stronger. The poultice had drawn considerable infection from the wound overnight, a promising sign that with proper care he might yet recover. She changed his bandages, coaxed him to drink a broth strengthened with herbs, and made sure he was comfortable before turning to the day's necessary chores. The animals needed tending, water needed hauling, and preparations needed making for whatever might come. All the while, Rebecca maintained a careful vigilance, frequently pausing in her work to scan the horizon and the trail leading from Riverdale. It was during one such moment of surveillance, as she collected eggs from the small henhouse behind the barn, that Rebecca spotted the dust cloud rising from the valley floor. Riders approaching, moving at the steady pace of men with purpose, rather than the casual gait of neighborly visits. She counted 5 distinct shapes as they drew nearer, 4 horsemen and a pack horse or mule. Rebecca's heart quickened, but her movements remained deliberate as she finished gathering the eggs and walked unhurriedly back to the cabin. Inside, she quickly roused Wanbli, who came to consciousness with the immediate alertness of a man accustomed to danger. "Riders coming," she explained tersely. 5 of them could be Hayes and his men. Despite his weakened state, Wanbli attempted to rise. "Must hide. If they find me here—" "The root cellar," Rebecca interrupted, already moving, to lift the trapdoor concealed beneath the braided rug in the kitchen. "Can you make it down the ladder?" With grim determination, Wanbli managed to descend into the earthen chamber below, each movement clearly causing him considerable pain. Rebecca passed down a water flask, additional bandages, and the oilskin packet he had guarded so carefully. "If something happens to me," she said, meeting his eyes with unwavering resolution, "wait until nightfall, then make for Fort Harrison. It's your best chance." Wanbli reached up to grasp her wrist briefly, the gesture conveying both gratitude and respect. "You risk much for a stranger." "I risk what my conscience demands," Rebecca replied simply, then closed the trapdoor and carefully rearranged the rug above it. She had barely completed this task when the sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced the arrival of the riders. Taking a moment to compose herself, Rebecca picked up the basket of eggs she had collected and stepped onto the porch with the practiced nonchalance of a woman interrupted during her morning chores. The sight that greeted her confirmed her worst fears. Ethan Hayes sat astride a tall buckskin gelding, his weather-beaten face partially obscured by a beard streaked with grey. Beside him rode 3 hard-looking men whose appearances suggested they shared Hayes's profession, if not his leadership. Behind them, the 5th horse carried what appeared to be supplies and several ominous bundles wrapped in canvas. "Mrs. Miller," Hayes called, removing his hat with a courtesy that did nothing to soften the predatory assessment in his pale blue eyes. "Fine morning." "Mr. Hayes," Rebecca acknowledged with a nod that neither welcomed nor rejected his presence. "What brings you and your men to my homestead?" Hayes dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, passing his reins to one of his companions before approaching the porch. He stopped at the bottom step, maintaining a distance that might have seemed respectful had it not positioned him perfectly to block any attempt Rebecca might make to retreat inside. "We're tracking a renegade," he explained, replacing his hat. "Lakota buck who attacked one of my men 3 days back during a legitimate enforcement action. Trail leads this direction." "I haven't seen any Lakota," Rebecca replied evenly, which was technically true at the moment, given Wanbli's concealment below ground. "Haven't seen much of anyone since harvest time, truth be told." Hayes's smile never reached his eyes. "Mind if we look around? Just to be certain, he's wounded, dangerous. Wouldn't want to think of a woman alone out here with such a threat nearby." The statement carried both a request and a veiled threat. Rebecca understood that refusing would only heighten Hayes's suspicions, while acquiescing might give her an opportunity to direct their search away from the cabin. "Of course," she said with a calm she did not feel, "though I'd appreciate if someone remained with the horses. My hens are nervous around unfamiliar mounts." It was a reasonable request that might limit the number of men searching her property, though Hayes's slight narrowing of eyes suggested he recognized the tactic. Nevertheless, he nodded to the youngest of his companions. "Jenkins, stay with the horses. Davis, check the barn and outbuildings. Cooper and I will have a look at the house." Rebecca's heart sank at this division of labor, but she maintained her composed expression as Hayes and the man called Cooper ascended the porch steps. Standing aside to let them enter the cabin, she silently calculated her options should they discover the root cellar's existence. Inside, Hayes made a show of casual interest in the cabin's simple furnishings while his eyes methodically assessed every corner and shadow. Cooper moved with less subtlety, openly checking behind furniture and peering into the small bedroom where Wanbley had spent the night. Rebecca followed them, basket still in hand, projecting an image of mild inconvenience rather than fear. "Fine place you've maintained since your husband passed," Hayes commented, running a finger along the mantel where Rebecca kept her few treasured possessions. A daguerreotype of Thomas, a small china figurine that had been her mother's, and a worn Bible. "Can't be easy, woman alone." "I manage," Rebecca replied, setting the basket on the table and folding her arms across her chest. "Though I'd manage better if I could get back to my chores." Hayes chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Always admired your spirit, Mrs. Miller. Not many widows would choose to stay out here rather than returning east or remarrying." Before Rebecca could respond, Cooper emerged from the bedroom. "Nothing there, boss. Bed's been slept in, but could just be hers." Hayes nodded, his gaze returning to Rebecca with renewed intensity. "Mind if we check your cellar, Mrs. Miller? These old homesteads usually have one for root vegetables and such." The question sent ice through Rebecca's veins, though she allowed none of her alarm to show on her face. "There's a small storage space under the porch for preserves," she offered, attempting to redirect him, "though I can't imagine why you'd think a wounded man would hide there." "Desperate men choose desperate hiding places," Hayes replied, his eyes now fixed on the braided rug beneath which lay the trapdoor to the root cellar. "And this rug seems a mite askew, doesn't it?" Rebecca's mind raced as Hayes took a deliberate step toward the braided rug. Time seemed to stretch like molasses on a winter morning as she weighed her increasingly limited options. Physical intervention would only confirm his suspicions and likely result in violence, given that his men now surrounded the cabin. Continuing to deny knowledge of what lay beneath might buy precious moments, but Hayes's focused attention on the misaligned rug suggested he already had strong suspicions. "Perhaps you'd care to explain your interest in my cellar, Mr. Hayes," she said, deliberately shifting her position to place herself between him and the trapdoor. "Most gentlemen would consider such intrusion into a lady's private domain rather inappropriate." Hayes's weathered face twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "We're far beyond concerns of propriety, Mrs. Miller. I've been tracking that savage for 5 days. His trail leads directly to your property, and those marks by your corral are unmistakably Lakota signs." His hand drifted casually toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "Now step aside, or I'll be forced to consider you an active accomplice rather than a merely misguided sympathizer." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Rebecca understood with crystal clarity that Hayes had no intention of leaving without searching the root cellar, and resistance would only endanger both her and Wanbley further. She needed to find another way, not to prevent discovery, which now seemed inevitable, but to create opportunity for escape. "Very well," she conceded with forced resignation. "There is a storage cellar. I use it for preserves and root vegetables." A dime. As she knelt to move the rug, Rebecca's knuckles rapped sharply against the wooden floor, twice in quick succession, hoping Wanbley would recognize the warning. She pulled back the braided covering to reveal the trapdoor set into the planking. "Open it," Hayes commanded, his revolver now drawn and leveled steadily at her. Rebecca grasped the iron ring and pulled, revealing the ladder descending into darkness below. Hayes stepped forward, peering down with narrowed eyes. The root cellar appeared empty at first glance, just shelves of preserved foods along one wall and bins of potatoes and turnips along another. "Light a lamp and get down there," he ordered, gesturing with the revolver. "Check every corner." With measured movements that betrayed nothing of her racing heart, Rebecca lit a small oil lamp from the embers in the hearth. She descended the ladder carefully, holding the light high to illuminate the earthen-walled space. There was no immediate sign of Wanbley, though Rebecca knew he must be concealed somewhere in the confined area. "Move those bins," Hayes called from above, his revolver still trained on her. "Check behind them." Rebecca complied, shifting the wooden containers of vegetables while her mind frantically assessed escape possibilities. The cellar had no other exit, merely a small ventilation grate near the ceiling that allowed fresh air but was far too small for human passage. As she moved the last bin, a sudden commotion erupted outside, shouts and a horse's alarmed whinny. Hayes's attention momentarily shifted toward the cabin door, his head turning instinctively toward the disturbance. In that fraction of a second, a shadow detached itself from beneath the rough workbench that stood against the far wall. Wanbley had somehow compressed his wounded body into the narrow space between bench and wall, concealed behind stacked empty preserve jars. Now he launched upward with explosive force, catching the edge of the trapdoor opening and swinging through with fluid grace, despite his injury. Hayes reacted with the trained reflexes of a frontiersman, swinging his weapon back toward this new threat, but too late. Wanbley crashed into him with momentum that sent both men tumbling across the cabin floor. The revolver discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet splintering a ceiling beam harmlessly above. Rebecca scrambled up the ladder to find Hayes and Wanbley locked in desperate struggle. Despite his wounded condition, the Lakota scout fought with focused intensity, years of combat experience evident in his economical movements. Hayes, however, had the advantages of uninjured strength and greater weight, gradually forcing Wanbley onto his back with one hand at his throat. Without hesitation, Rebecca grabbed the cast-iron skillet hanging beside the hearth and brought it down with all her strength against the back of Hayes's head. The impact produced a sickening thud, and the bounty hunter slumped forward, unconscious atop his opponent. "Quickly!" she urged, helping Wanbley push the insensate Hayes aside. "His men will have heard the shot." Indeed, boots were already pounding on the porch steps. Wanbley staggered to his feet, fresh blood seeping through the bandages at his side. Where the struggle had reopened his wound, Rebecca pressed Hayes's dropped revolver into his hand as the cabin door burst open. Cooper, Hayes's deputy, stood framed in the doorway, his own weapon already drawn. For a heartbeat, the tableau held. Cooper, taking in the scene of his unconscious leader, sprawled on the floor, the Lakota scout bleeding but upright with revolver in hand. Rebecca Miller, standing beside him with unmistakable determination, etched across her features. The momentary hesitation cost Cooper dearly. Wanbley fired first, the bullet catching the bounty hunter in the shoulder and spinning him backward through the open doorway. Shouts from outside indicated the remaining men were responding to the gunfire, likely taking cover around the cabin's perimeter. "We can't stay here," Wanbley said, his voice taut but controlled, despite obvious pain. "They will burn the cabin to force us out if necessary." Rebecca nodded, her mind already calculating options. "The back window through the bedroom. If we can reach the trees beyond the garden, we might lose them in the forest." Even as she spoke, she gathered essential supplies. A small sack of jerky and hardtack she kept ready for emergencies, her medical kit, a water skin, and Thomas's hunting knife from its place by the hearth. Wanbley moved with surprising stealth to the bedroom door, listening intently to the movements outside. "Davis is circling around back," he reported quietly. "The young one, Jenkins, is tending to Cooper. The wound is not fatal." Rebecca joined him at the door, clutching their meager provisions. "I'll go first," she decided. "Draw their attention while you follow. You're wounded and they'll focus their fire on you if they see you first." Before Wanbley could object, she slipped through the bedroom and eased open the window that overlooked her kitchen garden. Without hesitation, she dropped the short distance to the ground and dashed toward the forest edge, deliberately making enough noise to attract attention. A shout rose behind her. "There she goes!" followed by the crack of a rifle. Bark splintered from a pine trunk just ahead as the bullet missed her by inches. Rebecca didn't slow, plunging into the undergrowth with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with these woods. The forest had been her sanctuary during 5 years of solitary living, and now she called upon that knowledge to guide her. Flight. She weaved between trees, choosing a path that offered cover while remaining passable for someone in Wanbli's wounded condition. Only when she had put several hundred yards between herself and the cabin did she pause, ducking behind a massive fallen oak to catch her breath and listen for pursuit. The forest had gone deadly quiet, the normal chatter of birds silenced by the intrusion of violence into their domain. Then came the sound she dreaded, the crash of undergrowth, as at least one pursuer followed her trail. Rebecca prepared to move again, planning to lead the chase further from the cabin to give Wanbli his best chance of escape in another direction. Before she could leave her temporary shelter, a hand clasped gently over her mouth from behind. She nearly lashed out before recognizing Wanbli, who had somehow approached with such silence that not even the forest creatures had marked his passage. He removed his hand and pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed eastward, deeper into the forest. Rebecca nodded her understanding, and together they set off, moving as quietly as their desperate circumstances allowed. For nearly an hour they traveled thus, Wanbli setting a grueling pace despite his reopened wound, which had soaked his bandages with alarming freshness. Twice they heard distant shouts as Hayes's men attempted to coordinate their search, but the sounds grew fainter as distance and the forest's natural acoustic barriers muffled them. Finally, as they crested a small rise covered in ancient white pines, Wanbli faltered, his face ashen with pain and exertion. Rebecca caught him before he could fall, guiding him to sit with his back against a broad trunk. "We need to rest," she insisted, kneeling to examine his wound. "You've reopened the gash completely. You can't continue like this." Despite his obvious exhaustion, Wanbli's dark eyes remained clear and focused. "Hayes will not stop," he said. "Simply, not now. We have wounded his pride as well as his men. He will bring more hunters, track us until we are found." "Then we need a better plan than simply running," Rebecca replied, using strips torn from her petticoat to rebind his wound. "Somewhere to hide until you're stronger, or some way to get word to this Colonel Williams at Fort Harrison." Wanbli was silent for a moment, his gaze turned inward as though consulting some internal map. "There is a place," he said finally, "sacred to my people, a hidden valley 3 ridges east of here. Few white men know of its existence. Those who do avoid it from superstition." "How far?" Rebecca asked, helping him to his feet once the fresh bandage was secured. "Half a day's journey for a healthy man," Wanbli admitted. "Longer in my condition, but Hayes and his men will not follow us there even if they discover our trail." It wasn't much of a plan, but it offered more hope than their current aimless flight. Rebecca nodded her agreement, and they set off again, Wanbli now leaning more heavily on her support as they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. As the day wore on, the forest gradually changed character, the familiar pines and hardwoods giving way to more ancient growth, massive hemlocks and gnarled oaks that seemed to watch their passing with the wisdom of centuries. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by carpets of moss and ferns that muffled their footsteps. Even the quality of light shifted, the afternoon sun filtering through the dense canopy to create dappled patterns that played across the forest floor. Like living things, despite the beauty surrounding them, Rebecca's concern grew with each passing hour. Wanbli's strength was clearly failing, his weight against her increasing as fever returned with the exertion of their flight. Their progress slowed to a painful crawl, each step seeming to require more effort than the last. "We should stop," she suggested as the light began to fade. "Rest properly until morning." Wanbli shook his head with stubborn determination. "Too exposed here. Valley is not far now. There will be shelter, water." They pushed on as twilight deepened, the forest growing increasingly primeval in the gathering darkness. Rebecca had never ventured this far from her homestead, and the unfamiliar terrain added to her sense of disorientation. Only Wanbley's unwavering confidence in their direction provided any reassurance that they weren't simply wandering deeper into wilderness from which they might never emerge. Just as true night settled over the forest, they reached the base of a sheer rock face that seemed to block any further eastward progress. Wanbley led them northward along its base until they came to what appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a shadow among shadows, a narrow fissure in the stone, barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. "The entrance," Wanbley explained, his voice now little more than a whisper as exhaustion claimed its toll. "Sacred way to the valley beyond." Rebecca peered dubiously at the dark opening. "Are you certain? It looks barely passable." "Appearances protect sacred places," Wanbley replied, managing a faint smile despite his pain. "The passage widens beyond the entrance." With no alternative and darkness making further travel through the forest increasingly treacherous, Rebecca helped Wanbley navigate the narrow opening. As promised, the passage widened after several yards, though not enough to walk comfortably side by side. They proceeded in single file, Rebecca following close behind Wanbley, one hand maintaining contact with his back to steady him if needed. The passage continued for what seemed an interminable distance, twisting through solid rock, occasionally widening into small chambers before narrowing again. There was no light save for the faintest luminescence from patches of pale fungi growing. Along the damp walls, the air grew increasingly moist, carrying scents of wet stone and distant growing things. When they finally emerged from the stone passage, Rebecca gasped involuntarily at the scene before them. They stood at the edge of a small valley, completely encircled by sheer cliffs, accessible only through the hidden passage they had just traversed. Moonlight spilled over the rim of the natural fortress, illuminating a landscape that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Ancient trees with massive, gnarled trunks stood sentinel around a central clearing. A small lake, its surface mirror-smooth, in the moonlight, occupied the valley's heart, fed by a delicate waterfall that spilled from a fissure halfway up the eastern cliff face. The clearing surrounding the lake was carpeted with what appeared to be unusually lush grass for the autumn season, interspersed with stands of what Rebecca recognized as medicinal plants, some familiar from her own garden, others she had only seen in illustrated botanical texts. "The Valley of Healing Waters," Wanbley said softly, his voice carrying reverence that transcended his physical distress. "My people have come here in times of greatest need for more generations than can be counted." Rebecca helped him toward the lake's edge, where a natural shelf of flat stone provided a place to rest. Wanbley sank down gratefully, his expression easing slightly, as though the valley itself provided some measure of relief from his pain. "The water," he instructed, gesturing toward the lake. "Bring some. It holds power to heal." Rebecca might have dismissed such a claim as desperate superstition had it come from anyone else, but something about this hidden valley defied rational explanation. The unnatural lushness of vegetation well into autumn, the perfect symmetry of the encircling cliffs, the hushed quality of the air that seemed to absorb sound rather than transmit it, all suggested a place set apart from ordinary reality. She knelt at the lake's edge, cupping her hands to gather water that felt strangely warm despite the cool night air. Returning to Wanbley, she helped him drink, then used more to bathe his face and the angry wound at his side. Whether through some property of the water itself or simply the relief of reaching sanctuary after their desperate flight, Wanbley's breathing gradually steadied, the feverish flush receding from his features. "We are safe here for now," he murmured, leaning back against the stone. Hayes and his men cannot find this place without a guide who knows the way. And if they capture such a guide? Rebecca asked, settling beside him as exhaustion began to claim her as well. My people would die before revealing this valley to men like Hayes, Wanbley replied with absolute certainty. Some places must remain sacred, untouched by greed and hatred. Rebecca found no cause to doubt his assessment. After tending to Wanbley's wound once more, using both her own herbal knowledge and plants he identified as particularly effective, they prepared a meager meal from the provisions she had grabbed during their hasty departure from the cabin. As they ate in companionable silence, the enormity of all that had transpired finally settled over Rebecca like a physical weight. Her home was now abandoned, possibly damaged during the confrontation with Hayes and his men. She had aided a fugitive, justified though her actions might be, and in doing so had herself become a fugitive from territorial justice as Hayes would surely present it. Everything she had built during 5 years of determined independence had been sacrificed in a single day's worth of moral choices. Yet despite these sobering realities, Rebecca found herself strangely at peace. For the first time since Thomas's death, her actions had been guided by something larger than mere survival or the maintenance of what remained of her previous life. She had acted according to principle rather than expedience, and in doing so, had perhaps found something of her true self that had been slowly suffocating beneath the weight of frontier pragmatism. You think of all you have lost, Wanbley observed quietly, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. Not lost, Rebecca corrected after a moment's reflection. Sacrificed, perhaps, but willingly for something that matters more. Wanbley nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. My people have a saying, the path that costs nothing leads nowhere worth traveling. The simple wisdom resonated deeply with Rebecca as she wrapped herself in the blanket she had managed to bring during their escape. As moonlight bathed the hidden valley and the soft sounds of night creatures emerged from the shadows, she allowed exhaustion to claim her at last, drifting into the first truly peaceful sleep she had known in years, dreamless and deep in the sanctuary of this place apart from the world's conflicts. Dawn in the valley brought its own form of magic. Rebecca woke to find sunlight streaming over the eastern cliff, creating ephemeral rainbows in the mist rising from the waterfall. The lake's surface glittered like scattered diamonds, and birds, unlike any she had seen in the settled regions, sang from the ancient trees surrounding the clearing. Most remarkable of all was Wanbley's condition. The Lakota scout sat cross-legged at the lake's edge, his upper body bare as he changed the bandage on his wound. The angry red inflammation that had surrounded the knife gash had receded dramatically overnight, replaced by the healthy pink of healing tissue. His movements, while still careful, showed none of the weakness that had marked their journey the previous day. The valley's medicine is strong, he explained, noticing her astonished expression as she approached. Water, plants, the sacred nature of this place, all work together to heal those deemed worthy of entering. Rebecca knelt beside him, examining the wound with the critical eye of someone who had treated everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries during her years on the frontier. The improvement defied medical explanation, yet she could not deny the evidence before her. It's remarkable, she acknowledged, helping him secure the fresh bandage. At this rate, you'll be fully healed in days rather than weeks. Wanbley nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed across the tranquil lake. Which means we must decide our next steps. Hayes will not abandon his hunt. The evidence I carry threatens not only him, but powerful men who profit from conflict with my people. The reminder of the oilskin packet sobered Rebecca's momentary wonder at their supernatural sanctuary. The document Wanblee carried represented their only hope of ending Hayes's predatory activities and perhaps preventing further bloodshed between settlers and the Lakota. Yet delivering it to the territorial governor in the face of Hayes's determined opposition remained a daunting challenge. "You mentioned Fort Harrison," Rebecca said, retrieving their small store of provisions to prepare a simple breakfast. "Could we reach Colonel Williams there? Would he help?" "Williams is honorable," Wanblee confirmed. "He would ensure the evidence reaches Governor Thompson, but Fort Harrison lies 4 days' journey west, through territory Hayes and his men will be watching closely now." "And your people?" Rebecca suggested. "The encampment at Thunder Basin?" Wanblee's expression darkened slightly. "My brother Chayton leads our band since our father's death last winter. He would shelter us, but..." He hesitated clearly. Weighing his words carefully, relations between our peoples grow more strained with each passing season. Your presence among the Lakota would be complicated. The diplomatic understatement wasn't lost on Rebecca. A white woman arriving at a Lakota encampment during a time of escalating tensions would create complications far beyond her personal safety. Even with Wanblee's protection, her reception would be uncertain at best, potentially hostile at worst. "Then we need a third option," she concluded, passing Wanblee a portion of their dwindling food supplies. "Someone with authority to act on. The evidence, but removed from Hayes's immediate sphere of influence." As they ate, they considered and discarded various possibilities. The local marshal in Riverdale was known to be sympathetic to the bounty hunters' activities, if not actively complicit in them. The nearest federal judge was in Bismarck, a journey of over a week through difficult terrain. Messages sent via the fledgling telegraph system would likely be intercepted if Hayes had indeed, as they suspected, cultivated allies throughout the region. "The governor arrives at Fort Harrison in 5 days," Rebecca explained to Chayton, who listened with the focused intensity of a born strategist. "If we can reach him directly with this evidence, bypassing Hayes and his network of allies, we might prevent the very war your warriors are preparing for." Chayton's expression remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed the weight of responsibility he carried. As leader of his band, he walked the precarious line between defending his people's rights and avoiding the devastating conflict that would result from open warfare against settler communities backed by territorial and federal forces. 5 days, he repeated, measuring the time against unknown calculations of his own. A difficult journey through watched territory. "Which is why we planned to take the northern route," Wanblee added, indicating the rough map they had prepared. Longer but less likely to be patrolled by Hayes's men. Chayton studied the proposed path, tracing it with a finger calloused from bow and lance. "This crosses the high ridge where winter comes early," he observed. "Already, the nights bring frost. A storm in those heights would mean death without proper supplies." The assessment was blunt but accurate. Their hastily gathered provisions and makeshift equipment would prove woefully inadequate if caught in the region's notorious early blizzards. Yet the alternative routes all carried greater risk of encountering Hayes and his bounty hunters. "Then we need another way," Rebecca acknowledged, refusing to surrender to the mounting obstacles, "or better supplies and guides who know the northern territories intimately." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, showed briefly in Chayton's stoic features. "You think like Lakota," he said, seeking the path around obstacles rather than charging through them. He turned to Wanblee, switching to their native tongue for a rapid exchange that Rebecca couldn't follow. The conversation appeared intense, with Chayton gesturing occasionally toward the valley entrance or the darkening sky visible above the encircling cliffs. Wanblee responded with equal animation, once placing his hand over his heart in what appeared to be a gesture of solemn promise or oath. Finally, Chaitan nodded decisively and returned his attention to Rebecca. "I have 100 warriors camped. 2 valleys north of here," he revealed. "We came seeking Wanbli when he failed to return from his scouting mission. Now I understand why." Rebecca absorbed this information with mingled hope and trepidation. The presence of so many Lakota warriors nearby represented potential allies, but also highlighted the precariousness of their situation. If Chaitan decided, the evidence they carried was insufficient to justify continued restraint, those same warriors could become the vanguard of the very conflict they hoped to prevent. "My brother believes your heart is true," Chaitan continued, his assessment direct and unadorned, "that you risked everything to save him, not for reward or advantage, but because your spirit could not allow injustice to pass unchallenged." Rebecca met his penetrating gaze without flinching. "I did what any person of conscience would do," she replied, though she knew full well how rare such choices had become in the complex moral landscape of the frontier. "No," Chaitan contradicted her with surprising gentleness. "Many would have looked away. Many have. It is why Hayes and his kind thrive. They count on good people choosing safety over righteousness." He made a decision then, signified by a subtle squaring of his shoulders. "Tomorrow at dawn, we will escort you to Fort Harrison by a different path, one known only to the Lakota, protected by our ancestors' spirits. My warriors will ensure you reach the governor with your evidence." The offer stunned Rebecca into momentary silence. Direct Lakota assistance of this magnitude represented an extraordinary commitment from a leader whose people had every reason to distrust white authorities. Before she could formulate a proper response, Wanbli provided context for his brother's unprecedented proposal. "Chaitan risks much," he explained quietly. "If territorial forces discover Lakota warriors near Fort Harrison, they might interpret it as an attack, especially with Hayes spreading lies about hostilities." Rebecca understood immediately the delicate balance Chaitan was attempting to maintain, supporting their mission while avoiding any action that might trigger the very conflict they sought to prevent. "How will you manage such risk?" she asked, addressing Chaitan directly. A ghost of a smile touched the Lakota leader's stern features. "By appearing to be what the White Eyes expect," he replied. "Not warriors, but a diplomatic party, those who would speak peace while others prepare war." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Governor Thompson was coming to Fort Harrison specifically for diplomatic discussions with Lakota representatives. Chaitan's arrival with a small delegation would appear to be exactly that: expected, legitimate, entirely consistent with the fort's current mission. "And we would be part of this delegation?" Rebecca asked, quickly grasping the implications. Chaitan nodded. "You will travel as our medicine woman, one who bridges worlds as some of our healers do. Wanbli will be part of my honor guard. We approach openly, demanding audience with the governor on matters of peace and justice. Hayes will attempt to intercept us," Wanbli pointed out, the strategist in him automatically identifying vulnerabilities in the plan. "Hayes is but one man, with perhaps a dozen hunters at his command," Chaitan replied, with the confidence of one accustomed to weighing military odds. "I will bring 30 warriors, more than enough to deter interference, while not so many as to trigger alarm at the fort." The plan was bold, yet calculated, walking a fine line between intimidation and provocation. Rebecca could see why Chaitan had risen to leadership among his people, despite his relative youth. He possessed the rare ability to balance aggression with restraint, tradition with innovation. "We leave at first light," Chaitan concluded, rising to his feet with the unconscious grace that both brothers shared. "Rest now. The journey will require all your strength, Rebecca Miller." With that, he retreated to the valley entrance, presumably to send word to his waiting warriors about the new plan. Wanbli watched his brother's departure with an expression mingling pride and concern. "Chaitan carries heavy burdens," he explained once they were alone again. "Our father's death left him leadership when conflict with the Wasiku grows more complicated each season. Many young warriors call for war, believing it better to die fighting than waste away on reservations like other tribes." Rebecca understood all too well the impossible position of leaders caught between legitimate grievances and the practical reality of overwhelming opposition. "And what does your brother believe?" she asked softly. Wanbli stared into the fire, its light reflecting in his dark eyes. "He believes our people must find a new path, neither surrender nor suicidal resistance. But such wisdom is difficult to maintain when blood cries out for vengeance." They lapsed into thoughtful silence, each contemplating the fragile opportunity before them. If they succeeded in reaching Governor Thompson with their evidence, Hayes and his bounty hunters might face justice, removing one immediate source of violence against the Lakota. Yet even that victory would address only a symptom of the deeper conflicts over land, resources, and fundamentally different ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world. As Rebecca finally settled onto her blanket for what remained of the night, she found herself wondering what Thomas would make of her current circumstances, allied with Lakota warriors fleeing territorial authorities, preparing to challenge corruption that reached into the highest levels of frontier governance. He had always believed in her strength, even when society dismissed women as inherently fragile creatures in need of constant protection and guidance. "You've got steel in your spine, Becky," he'd told her once after she'd helped him set a neighboring settler's broken leg without flinching at the man's screams. "Most men don't recognize it because they're not looking for it in a woman, but it's there all the same." That steel would be tested in the days ahead, perhaps beyond any challenge she had yet faced. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca's last conscious thought was a quiet acknowledgement that regardless of what awaited them at Fort Harrison, she had already crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to her former life. Whether that represented liberation or loss remained to be seen. Dawn in the sacred valley brought with it a sense of purpose that dispelled the previous night's uncertainties. Rebecca woke to find Chaitan had returned with 3 of his warriors, all preparing for the journey with the efficient movements of men accustomed to swift deployment. Wanbli, too, seemed transformed, his injuries showing remarkable healing. After just 2 nights in the valley, his bearing once again that of a warrior rather than a fugitive. "My brother has brought these for you," Wanbli said, presenting Rebecca with a carefully folded bundle of soft buckskin. "Your current clothing would draw attention during our journey." The garments were beautifully crafted, a fringed dress, adorned with subtle beadwork, leggings and moccasins that would allow for both comfort and quiet movement through the forest. Most striking was a medicine pouch, similar to those worn by the Lakota healers, decorated with symbols Rebecca didn't recognize, but suspected carried significant meaning to those who understood their language. "These belonged to Standing Dove, a healer among our people who walked between worlds as you now do," Chaitan explained, approaching as she examined the gifts. "She learned from Wasiku doctors while maintaining our ways of medicine. The pouch marks you as one who heals through many kinds of knowledge." The generosity of the gift, items clearly of both practical and cultural value, moved Rebecca deeply. "I'm honored," she said, meeting Chaitan's gaze directly. "I'll try to be worthy of what these symbols represent." A flicker of approval crossed the Lakota leader's normally impassive features. "Prepare yourself," he instructed. "We leave when the sun clears the eastern cliff." Rebecca retreated to a secluded corner of the valley to change into the Lakota garments. The buckskin dress fit remarkably well, its design allowing freedom of movement while providing warmth against the autumn chill. The moccasins, too, seemed made for her feet, their beaded designs catching the early morning light in subtle patterns of blue and gold. When she rejoined the others, Wanbli nodded approval. "Now you look like Wing Yang Wakan, medicine woman," he said. "Few soldiers will look closely at one dressed so." Their preparations complete, the small party departed the sacred valley just as sunlight spilled over the eastern rim. Chaitan led the way, followed by two warriors whose names Rebecca learned were Akacheta and Makka. Wanbli walked beside Rebecca, with the warrior called Hokshila bringing up the rear, his watchful gaze constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit or danger. Their path led north initially, following game trails so faint that Rebecca would have missed them entirely without Lakota guidance. By midday they had climbed considerably, reaching a ridgeline that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. Pine forests stretched in all directions, interrupted occasionally by meadows golden with autumn grasses or rocky outcroppings that rose like islands from the sea of trees. "There," Chaitan said, pointing northwest to where a thin column of smoke rose barely visible against the blue sky. "Our camp. We will reach it by sunset." The remainder of the day's journey proved grueling for Rebecca, despite her frontier-hardened constitution. The Lakota maintained a pace that seemed effortless to them, but required all her determination to match. They moved with the organic rhythm of those born to the land, navigating difficult terrain with an ease that made their progress appear deceptively simple. True to Chaitan's prediction, they reached the Lakota encampment as the day's light began to fade. Rebecca had been unsure what to expect, perhaps a temporary cluster of hide teepees like those described in Eastern newspapers. Instead, she found herself approaching a well-established camp that blended harmoniously with its natural surroundings. The 100 warriors Chaitan had mentioned were camped in ordered groups around central fires, their horses picketed nearby in a natural meadow where they grazed contentedly. What impressed Rebecca most, however, was the discipline evident throughout. The camp. Despite the large number of warriors present, activities proceeded with minimal noise and maximum efficiency. Food being prepared, weapons maintained, scouts returning or departing with quiet purpose. Their arrival created an immediate stir. Warriors paused in their activities, watching with undisguised curiosity as Chaitan led their unusual party into the camp's center. Rebecca felt dozens of eyes upon her, assessments being made, judgments formed about the white woman in Lakota dress walking beside their leader's brother. Chaitan addressed his assembled warriors in their native tongue, his deep voice carrying authority that required no translation. Rebecca recognized Wanbli's name mentioned several times, and occasionally what sounded like haze amidst the flow of unfamiliar words. At one point, Chaitan gestured toward her, prompting a murmur among the listeners that she couldn't interpret as either approval or objection. When he finished speaking, Chaitan turned to Rebecca. "I have told them of your courage in helping my brother," he explained, "and of the evidence we carry that may prevent unnecessary bloodshed. They will accept your presence among us, though some remain skeptical of any justice from Wasikyu authorities." The diplomatic phrasing suggested more significant reservations than Chaitan was directly expressing, but Rebecca appreciated his efforts to integrate her into the camp without opposition. "Thank them for their tolerance," she replied. "I understand their doubts are well earned by history." Her acknowledgement of past injustices seemed to register with those warriors close enough to hear, earning subtle nods of recognition, if not quite acceptance. Chaitan directed them to a small tipi that had been prepared near the center of the camp, explaining that she and Wanbli would rest there while he selected the warriors who would accompany their mission to Fort Harrison. The tipi's interior proved surprisingly comfortable, with buffalo robes spread across the ground for sitting and sleeping, and a small central fire that provided both warmth and light. Wanbli joined her shortly after, bringing food prepared by the camp's women, a rich stew of venison and wild onions, accompanied by a flat bread unlike anything Rebecca had tasted before. "The council discusses which warriors will accompany us," he explained between bites. "Those with the calmest spirits, least likely to react with violence if provoked." "Is there much disagreement?" Rebecca asked, sensing undercurrents beneath the camp's orderly surface. Wanbli considered his response carefully. "Some believe any approach to Fort Harrison is foolish, that the governor's promises will prove empty, like so many before. Others wish to bring more warriors, a show of strength rather than diplomatic intent." He shrugged slightly. "Chaitin will decide. His wisdom guides our people through difficult times." Their meal complete, Rebecca found herself growing weary as the day's exertions caught up with her. Wanbli noticed her failing energy and rose to leave. "Rest," he advised. "Tomorrow we prepare for the final journey. Chaitin will want to depart at dawn the day after." Left alone in the tipi, Rebecca arranged the buffalo robes into a comfortable sleeping pallet. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive, as her mind processed all she had experienced since finding Wanbli wounded outside her cabin, a lifetime of events compressed into mere days. The woman who had lived in cautious isolation for 5 years had now aligned herself with Lakota warriors against territorial authorities, gambling her future on the hope that justice might prevail over corruption and prejudice. She was almost drifting into sleep when the teepee flap opened, admitting a female figure silhouetted against the night fires outside. The woman entered silently, carrying what appeared to be folded garments, which she placed beside Rebecca's sleeping area. In the dim firelight, Rebecca could make out an aging but still handsome face, marked with the distinctive tattoos of a Lakota medicine woman. "I am Zintkala," the woman said, in accented English, settling gracefully across the fire from Rebecca, mother of Chaitin and Wanbli. The unexpected introduction brought Rebecca fully awake. "I'm honored," she replied, sitting up to properly acknowledge her visitor. "Your sons have shown me great kindness." Zintkala studied Rebecca with penetrating, dark eyes that missed nothing. "Wanbli says you saved his life, that you fought the man Hayes to protect him." "I did what conscience required," Rebecca replied, uncomfortable with what felt like undue credit for basic human decency. A hint of a smile touched Zintkala's weathered features. "Conscience," she repeated, as though testing the word. "Not all. Wasiku, listen to this conscience when it speaks of Lakota lives." The observation, delivered without rancor but with unflinching honesty, struck Rebecca's heart with its simple truth. How many settlers in Riverdale would have made the same choice she had? How many would have instead turned Wanbli over to Hayes? Without question, accepting the bounty hunter's characterization of all Lakota as dangerous hostiles. "Too few," she acknowledged quietly. "On either side of this divide, those who see the humanity in others beyond the boundaries of tribe or race." Zintkala nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. "I have brought you these," she said, indicating the folded garments, "for when you reach the fort. White woman's clothes, but with our medicine sewn inside where eyes cannot see." Rebecca carefully unfolded what proved to be a settler woman's practical traveling outfit, sturdy skirt, shirtwaist and jacket that would allow her to pass unremarked among white society. Examining them more carefully, she discovered tiny medicine bundles sewn into hidden places within the seams and hems, indigenous protection incorporated into Wasiku appearance. "The soldiers will not look beyond what their eyes expect to see," Zintkala explained. "They will see only a white woman with Lakota guides, not a bridge between worlds carrying dangerous truths." The strategic wisdom of the gift impressed Rebecca as much as its thoughtfulness. By returning to settler appearance before approaching Fort Harrison, she would trigger fewer immediate suspicions, potentially gaining precious time to reach the governor before Hayes or his allies could intervene. "Thank you," she said with genuine gratitude. "This may help us succeed where we might otherwise fail." Zintkala acknowledged the thanks with a slight inclination of her head. "My sons say you seek justice through Wasiku law, that you believe this governor will punish Hayes and his hunters when he sees the evidence you carry." There was a question embedded within the statement, one that cut to the heart of their mission's fundamental uncertainty. "I believe Governor Thompson is a man of principle," Rebecca replied carefully. "Whether his principles will withstand political pressure from those who profit from conflict with your people, that I cannot. You promise with certainty." The honesty seemed to please Zintkala more than empty reassurances would have. "Uncertainty walks with us always," she observed with the philosophical acceptance of one who had witnessed a lifetime of promises made and broken. "But to do nothing guarantees suffering will continue." They spoke for some time longer, the aging medicine woman sharing insights about the camp they now occupied, and the delicate balance Chayton maintained between honoring Lakota traditions and adapting to the changing realities of the territory. In turn, Rebecca found herself speaking of Thomas, of the life they had tried to build on the frontier before illness claimed him, and of her stubborn determination to maintain independence in a society that viewed unattached women with suspicion, at best, predatory interest at worst. When Zintkala finally rose to leave, she paused at the teepee entrance, framed against the night sky. "Sleep well, Rebecca Miller," she said softly. "Tomorrow you will meet the people properly, and they will take your measure as I have done tonight." After the medicine woman's departure, Rebecca found sleep coming more easily, as though Zintkala's visit had somehow balanced energies she hadn't recognized were in discord. Her last conscious thoughts were of the extraordinary women she had encountered throughout her life. Her own mother, who had encouraged education unusual for daughters of her generation. Mary Lambert, the neighbor who had taught her herb lore when she first arrived on the frontier. And now Zintkala, whose quiet strength had sustained a family and community through decades of upheaval and loss. Different worlds, different traditions, but a common thread of resilience that transcended the artificial boundaries men had drawn across the land. Morning arrived with a cacophony of camp sounds, horses nickering, children's voices carrying from somewhere beyond the circle of warrior. Tipis, the rhythmic chopping of wood for morning fires. Rebecca dressed quickly in her Lakota garments, carefully setting aside Zintkala's gift of settler clothing for when they approached Fort Harrison. Emerging into dawn light that painted the surrounding pines with gold, she found the camp fully awake and engaged in preparations that went beyond routine morning activities. Warriors were selecting their finest regalia from painted parfleche bags, women were preparing special foods, and everywhere there seemed a purposeful energy that suggested significance beyond ordinary days. Wanbli appeared at her side, looking remarkably recovered despite the serious wound he had suffered less than a week earlier. "The camp prepares to honor you," he explained, noting her confused observation of the activities. "It is our way when someone saves the life of one of our own." Rebecca felt immediately uncomfortable with such recognition. "That's not necessary," she protested. "I only did what conscience required." Wanbli finished for her, a rare smile softening his usually stoic features. "My mother told me of your words, but among our people, actions that preserve life are honored regardless of motivation. To refuse would cause greater offense than accepting with humility." Thus advised, Rebecca allowed Wanbli to guide her toward the camp's central gathering area, where Chayton stood conferring with a group of older warriors who appeared to hold advisory roles. At their approach, the Lakota leader turned, greeting them with formal dignity. "The council has decided," he announced without preamble. 30 warriors will accompany us to Fort Harrison, including our best speakers and those who understand Wasikyu ways most clearly. We leave tomorrow at dawn." The efficient decisiveness with which the Lakota organized their expedition continued to impress Rebecca. In her experience, similar undertakings among settlers invariably involved protracted debates, competing egos, and eventual compromise that satisfied no one completely. Here, once the leader had considered advice and made his determination, action, followed without hesitation or second-guessing. "Today," Chayton continued, "we honor the one who preserved my brother's life and brings us opportunity for justice without further bloodshed." He gestured toward a large central fire where preparations for some ceremony were clearly underway. The people wished to know the woman who walks between worlds with courage. The morning unfolded into an experience unlike anything in Rebecca's previous life. She was seated in a place of honor beside Zintkala, while Chayton and Wanbli occupied positions that marked them as leaders of the gathering. Warriors and families approached in small groups, each offering gifts according to their means: beautifully tanned hides, beaded moccasins, bundles of sacred herbs, and in one memorable instance, a dappled grey pony presented by a young warrior, whose life Wanbli had apparently saved during a previous conflict. As each gift was presented, the giver shared brief words in Lakota, which Wanbli translated for Rebecca's benefit. The messages carried common themes of gratitude for her protection of a tribal member, recognition of her healing skills, and acknowledgement of her willingness to risk her own safety in pursuit of justice. Some of the older members spoke of hopes for a time when their peoples might live without the constant threat of violence between them, their weathered faces reflecting both skepticism born of experience and stubborn hope that refused extinguishment. Most moving was the approach of a young woman carrying an infant, her eyes reflecting a grief too recent to have fully healed. "This is Wichinchala," Wanbli explained quietly, "widow of our cousin Mato, who was killed by Hayes and his hunters. The child never saw his father." The young mother spoke softly in Lakota, her voice breaking occasionally, though her bearing remained proud. When she finished, she removed a beaded necklace from around her own neck and placed it gently over Rebecca's bowed head. She says, Wanbli translated, his own voice thick with emotion, that you cannot return her husband or give her son his father, but in seeking justice for his death, you honor his spirit and give meaning to his sacrifice. The necklace has been in her family for 4 generations. She asks that you wear it when you speak to the governor, so that Mato's spirit stands with you. Rebecca felt tears threatening as she accepted the profound responsibility conveyed in this most personal of gifts. "Tell her I will wear it with honor," she managed, reaching out to grasp the young widow's hand briefly, "and that her husband's name will be spoken when justice is demanded." The ceremony continued through midday, concluding with a feast where Rebecca was encouraged to sample traditional Lakota foods prepared specially for the occasion. Throughout the gathering, she observed the subtle dynamics of the community, the deference shown to elders despite Chayton's formal leadership, the comfortable equality between men and women in many interactions, the way children were indulged by the entire community rather than disciplined solely by parents. As the afternoon progressed, preparations for the journey to Fort Harrison intensified. Horses were selected and readied, provisions packed, weapons inspected and prepared. Rebecca found herself included in these preparations as naturally as if she had always been part of the community. Her suggestions about approaching the fort listened to with respectful attention, her questions answered with patient detail. By evening, everything was in readiness for their departure at dawn. The 30 warriors chosen to accompany them had been identified and briefed on their roles. Some would act as ceremonial honor guards, others as hunters to provide food during the journey, still others as scouts to ensure their path remained clear of potential ambush. All understood the delicate nature of their mission and the discipline required to present themselves as a diplomatic party rather than a war band. As darkness settled over the camp, Chaitin called a final council fire where those who would remain behind received instructions for maintaining vigilance during the leadership's absence. Rebecca, seated beside Wanblee, observed the careful balance the Lakota leader maintained, acknowledging the legitimate grievances that had his warriors calling for violence, while channeling that energy toward the possibility of justice through their current mission. If we do not return within 7 days, Chaitin told his people, or if word comes that Hayes has prevailed against us, you must lead our people north to the Powder River country where our relatives will shelter you until spring. Do not seek immediate vengeance, for that is what our enemies hope for, an excuse to bring overwhelming force against us. The instructions demonstrated tactical wisdom born of hard experience. Chaitin was ensuring his people's survival regardless of the diplomatic mission's outcome, preserving their strength for longer-term resistance rather than sacrificing lives in emotional but ultimately futile gestures of defiance. As the council concluded and the camp began settling for the night, Rebecca found herself drawn to the edge of the clearing, where the endless carpet of stars stretched overhead, untouched by the conflicts that divided the land beneath them. She stood in contemplative silence, absorbing the beauty of the wilderness night, while mentally preparing for the challenges that awaited them at Fort Harrison. Soft footsteps announced Wanblee's approach, though she suspected he had deliberately made himself heard rather than startling her with the silent movement he was capable of. He stood beside her for several moments, sharing her skyward gaze before speaking. "You have questions," he observed, "about what happens after." Rebecca nodded, appreciating his perceptiveness. "If we succeed, if Hayes and his hunters face justice and the governor acknowledges the wrongs committed against your people, what then? Does anything truly change?" It was the essential question that had troubled her throughout the day's ceremonies. Even if their immediate mission achieved its aims, the fundamental conflicts over land, resources, and cultural survival would remain unresolved. The governor might remove one corrupt bounty hunter, but the systems that had allowed Hayes to flourish would persist. Wanblee considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "One stone does not change a river's course," he acknowledged, "but many stones, placed with purpose over time." He left the metaphor unfinished, the implication clear. "You see our journey as one stone among many," Rebecca surmised. "Perhaps an important one," Wanblee amended. "If the governor truly listens, if Wasikyu laws are applied equally to those who harm our people, it creates possibility." He searched for the precise words to convey his meaning. Space for other voices to be heard, time for wiser paths to be found. The moderate optimism surprised Rebecca, given all that Wanblee and his people had endured. Some would say such hope is naive after so many broken promises. "Hope is never naive," Wanblee countered with unexpected intensity. "It is the most practical choice when alternatives lead only to destruction." He gestured toward the sleeping camp. "My brother could lead our warriors to burn every settlement within 50 miles. We would kill many Wasikyu before the army destroyed us. Songs would be sung of our bravery for generations, and our children would inherit only ashes." The stark assessment reflected the impossible choices faced by indigenous leaders throughout the territories. Between resistance that preserved honor but ensured eventual annihilation, and accommodation that might preserve lives while sacrificing cultural independence. Chaitan appeared to be charting a third course between these extremes, seeking justice within Wasikyu systems while maintaining Lakota sovereignty and traditional ways. "And you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "What happens to you when this is finished? You can't return to scouting for the army after defying Hayes." Wanbley's expression revealed nothing of his personal concerns. "The path reveals itself with each step," he replied, the philosophical response typical of his measured approach to life. "Perhaps I will remain with my people, helping Chaitan navigate between worlds. Or perhaps—" He hesitated, glancing briefly at Rebecca before continuing. "Perhaps there are other ways to build bridges between our peoples." The unspoken implication hung in the night air between them, neither addressed nor dismissed. In the brief days since their first encounter, a connection had formed between them that transcended their different backgrounds. A recognition of kindred spirits who valued justice and compassion above the artificial boundaries of race and culture. What form such a connection might take in the complex reality of frontier society remained uncertain, but its existence could not be denied. "We should rest," Wanbley suggested after a comfortable silence. "Dawn comes early, and the journey to Fort Harrison will demand all our strength." Rebecca nodded, knowing he was right yet reluctant to end this moment of quiet understanding. "Thank you," she said simply, encompassing in those words gratitude not just for his company in this moment, but for all he had taught her about dignity and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Together, they walked back toward the camp, their path illuminated by starlight and the dying embers of council fires. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangers, but tonight had provided a glimpse of possibility, not just for their immediate mission, but for the harder work of building understanding between worlds that had too long existed in fear and suspicion of one another. As Rebecca settled onto her sleeping robes in the teepee, she found her thoughts returning to the young widow Wichinchala and her fatherless child. Beyond the political implications of their journey to Fort Harrison lay the human cost of injustice. Families shattered, traditions threatened, communities living under constant threat of violence. Whatever came after, Rebecca knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found her purpose in standing against such suffering, regardless of the personal cost. With that knowledge providing unexpected peace, she drifted into sleep beneath the painted symbols adorning the teepee's interior, ancient patterns that had guided the Lakota through generations of adversity and adaptation, resilient as the human spirit that had created them. With quick coordination born of their developing partnership, Rebecca approached Captain Crawford to provide reassurance, while Wanbley moved to greet his brother with appropriate protocol. By the time they reconvened at the edge of town, a calm had been established. Riverdale citizens watching with nervous fascination from what they considered safe distance, while Chaitan's warriors maintained dignified formation that projected ceremony rather than threat. "My brother brings the gift of life," Wanbley explained quietly to Rebecca as Chaitan dismounted and approached them. "Among our people, when someone saves a life at risk to themselves, they are honored with wealth that demonstrates the immeasurable value of what they preserved." The explanation provided context for the extraordinary assembly, but Rebecca still felt overwhelmed by its scale and public nature. Before she could respond, Chaitan stood before them, resplendent in ceremonial attire that marked this as occasion of profound significance to the Lakota. "Rebecca Miller," he began, his deep voice carrying clearly to onlookers from both communities, "you saved my brother's life when others would have delivered him to death. You risked your home, your safety, and your standing among your own people to preserve one Lakota warrior." He gestured toward the impressive herd of horses stretching behind the warrior formation. Our people recognize such courage cannot be repaid with ordinary gifts. These 100 horses, our finest stock, each chosen for strength and spirit, represent token of debt that cannot truly be satisfied. We offer them with gratitude that will endure beyond seasons of our lives. The formal presentation, delivered in English, clearly intended for Riverdale's witnesses as much as Rebecca herself, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic opportunity this ceremony presented. Chayton was not merely fulfilling cultural obligation, but deliberately creating public demonstration of Lakota honor, generosity, and adherence to principles that many settlers erroneously believed. Absent from native societies, recognition of this deeper purpose helped Rebecca formulate appropriate response. Drawing on what she had learned of Lakota protocol during her time with their community, she stepped forward with dignified acknowledgement of the extraordinary gift. Chief Chayton, I accept this honor with profound appreciation for its meaning. Among your people, what guidance I offered your brother came from principles my own parents taught, that all worthy lives deserve protection regardless of the divisions others create between peoples. She paused, weighing her next words carefully given the significant audience from both communities. With your permission, I would dedicate most of these magnificent animals to establishing a common herd that will benefit both our peoples. Horses, under joint stewardship of Lakota wisdom and settler resources, symbolizing the cooperation possible when we recognize shared humanity above artificial boundaries. The proposal represented innovative response to gift that couldn't simply be declined without grave offense, yet created practical complications if accepted traditionally. 100 horses represented wealth beyond any private citizen's reasonable management, particularly given Rebecca's new official responsibilities. By suggesting conversion of personal gift into community resource, she offered solution that honored Chayton's gesture while advancing their broader mission of building cooperation between divided peoples. A murmur passed through both assembled groups, surprise from the Lakota warriors at this unconventional response, mixed reactions from Riverdale citizens witnessing exchange from town's edge. Chayton himself remained expressionless for several moments, considering implications of Rebecca's proposal with the measured assessment that marked his leadership style. Then, to collective surprise of all observers, he smiled, a rare, full expression that transformed his typically solemn features. Once again, you demonstrate wisdom that transcends boundaries between our peoples, he said, approval evident in his tone. Your suggestion honors the gift's spirit while creating legacy beyond single lifetime. I accept this dedication with one condition, that 20 horses remain yours personally, as no leader serves effectively without resources matching their responsibilities. The diplomatic compromise reflected Chayton's political acumen, affirming Rebecca's innovative proposal while ensuring she maintained personal stake in the gift's value. It also established framework for unprecedented cooperation between communities, typically separated by suspicion and conflict. William Foster approached cautiously from Riverdale's contingent, having apparently been selected as settlement representative for this unexpected situation. Where would such joint herd be maintained? He asked practically, and under whose authority? The valley south of Eagle Creek has excellent grazing currently unused, Chayton replied without hesitation, suggesting prior consideration of this possibility. Equal distance between Riverdale and our winter encampment at Thunder Basin. Joint council of 3 Lakota and 3 settler representatives could oversee management, with offspring distributed to benefit poorest families from both peoples. The detailed response revealed careful planning behind what had appeared spontaneous ceremonial gesture. Chayton had apparently anticipated potential reactions and prepared substantive proposals that addressed practical concerns while advancing. Broader vision of cooperation. This strategic foresight further impressed Rebecca, confirming her assessment of the Lakota leader's exceptional abilities. Foster seemed momentarily taken aback by comprehensive proposal offered in response to his simple question. That would require significant discussion among Riverdale's council, he noted, though his expression suggested personal interest in the concept. Of course, Chayton acknowledged reasonably. Such cooperation requires deliberate consideration by all involved. We offer the possibility for your community's reflection. He turned back to Rebecca and Wanbley. For today, we complete the gift of life ceremony as our traditions require, then depart in peace, leaving your settlement undisturbed. What followed was extraordinary cultural exchange, unlike anything Riverdale had witnessed in its frontier history. With Rebecca and Wanbley centered in ceremonial space established at town's edge, Chayton conducted traditional Lakota honor ceremony, warriors forming protective circle, while elders prayed and sang songs, recognizing exceptional courage that preserved tribal members' life. Throughout the ceremony, Rebecca noted fascinating transformation among Riverdale's observers. Initial fear had given way to cautious curiosity, then to genuine interest as the ritual's beauty and dignity became apparent even to those unfamiliar with its cultural significance. Several children had moved closer despite parental caution, clearly entranced by the colorful regalia and rhythmic songs unlike anything in their settlement experience. When ceremonial aspects concluded, practical transitions began. The promised 20 personal horses were separated from main herd, each animal presented individually to Rebecca with description of its qualities and lineage. Information she suspected would prove valuable given her limited experience with horsemanship at this scale. The remaining 80 magnificent animals were ceremonially designated for proposed joint herd, with temporary arrangements made for their care pending establishment of formal management structure. As these practical matters concluded, Rebecca observed William Foster engaged in serious conversation with several prominent Riverdale citizens, their expressions suggesting intense discussion of Chayton's unprecedented proposal. The banker finally approached their group with careful diplomatic expression. Chief Chayton, the town council would like to invite you and 2 advisors to informal discussion of your proposal this evening, if acceptable. Nothing binding, simply exploration of possibilities this unexpected situation presents. The invitation represented remarkable departure from typical frontier settlement relations with native leaders, suggesting genuine consideration rather than dismissal of Chayton's cooperative vision. Rebecca caught Wanbley's subtle expression of surprise mirroring her own, both recognizing significant breakthrough in community perceptions this represented. I would be honored to join such discussion, Chayton replied with appropriate diplomacy. Understanding grows through words exchanged in good faith, even when agreement remains distant. As arrangements were finalized for this unprecedented meeting, Rebecca found herself momentarily overwhelmed by day's dramatic developments. What had begun as ordinary morning establishing their new office had transformed into extraordinary public ceremony and potentially historic discussion between communities typically separated by suspicion and conflict. The bridges they hoped to build between worlds were taking shape with unexpected rapidity, though whether these initial structures would withstand inevitable storms remained uncertain. Wanbley joined her as Chayton departed with Foster to make arrangements for evening's discussion. My brother never acts without multiple purposes, he observed quietly. The horses honor you truly, but also create opportunity for cooperation that might otherwise have taken seasons to establish. He's a remarkable leader, Rebecca acknowledged, capable of maintaining traditional values while adapting to changing circumstances without surrendering essential principles. Like someone else I have come to know, Wanbley replied. his gaze, meeting hers with meaning that transcended their professional partnership. The personal observation caught Rebecca momentarily off guard, though its sincerity warmed her despite the public setting. Their developing relationship had proceeded with careful restraint given complex circumstances surrounding their official responsibilities, yet moments like this revealed deepening connection beneath professional collaboration. "We should prepare for tonight's discussion," she suggested, redirecting focus to immediate responsibilities while acknowledging his comment with subtle smile. If Riverdale's council is genuinely considering Chaitin's proposal, proper documentation will be essential for establishing framework both communities can accept. With characteristic efficiency, they returned to their office to prepare materials that might support evening's historic discussion. Rebecca drafted potential agreement structures based on her knowledge of territorial legal requirements, while Wanbley prepared cultural context explaining Lakota concepts of shared stewardship that differed from settler notions of exclusive ownership. Together they created foundation for discussion that might bridge seemingly incompatible worldviews through practical cooperation addressing needs of both communities. As evening approached, Chaitin returned with 2 senior advisors from his delegation, respected elders whose presence underscored serious intention behind proposed cooperation. Rebecca and Wanbley joined them, providing both official territorial representation and personal bridge between cultures given their unique partnership. Foster had arranged meeting in town hall rather than council's usual private chambers, symbolic choice that suggested transparency in proceedings typically conducted behind closed doors. To Rebecca's measured surprise, significant citizen attendance materialized as meeting time approached. Not merely council members and prominent business owners, but ordinary townspeople whose interest appeared genuine rather than merely curious. The audience included wives and even children, suggesting community-wide recognition of potentially historic nature of discussions about to unfold. The meeting itself proceeded with remarkable civility given historical tensions between the communities represented. Chaitin presented detailed proposal for joint herd management with eloquence that impressed even skeptical council members. Rebecca provided territorial legal framework that could protect arrangement from outside interference, while Wanbley offered practical insights addressing concerns from both perspectives. Foster and Progressive Council faction supported concept, with pragmatic financial analysis demonstrating potential economic benefits beyond symbolic cooperation. Opposition naturally emerged from predictable sources, citizens with connections to Hayes and his bounty hunters, representatives of mining interests that had profited from manufactured conflict, individuals whose frontier identity remained rooted in perception of native peoples as fundamentally different and threatening. Yet the evening's most significant development was not the expected resistance, but the thoughtful consideration given Chaitin's proposal by community members previously uninvolved in such matters. A local schoolteacher questioned whether joint management might include educational opportunities for children from both communities to learn each other's languages and traditions. A blacksmith suggested technical exchange, where Lakota horse training methods might complement settler veterinary practices. A minister tentatively proposed shared celebrations at harvest time, noting similarities between certain Lakota ceremonies and Christian harvest festivals that might form basis for cultural exchange beyond mere economic cooperation. Throughout these discussions, Rebecca observed transformation occurring before her eyes. Not dramatic conversion from suspicion to trust, but subtle shift from automatic rejection to cautious consideration, from assumption of unbridgeable difference to recognition of potential common ground. The process unfolding in Riverdale's town hall represented microcosm of the very transition she and Wanbley had committed to nurture throughout the territory, through their official responsibilities. Near meeting's conclusion, William Foster proposed formal motion for Council's consideration, establishment of preliminary committee to develop specific framework for joint herd management with equal representation from both communities and regular public reports on progress. The motion passed with 7 votes supporting, 3 opposing, and 1 abstention. Not unanimous endorsement, but significant majority, suggesting meaningful shift in community perspective. As gathering dispersed into crisp autumn evening, Rebecca found herself momentarily alone with Chayton, who had observed final vote with characteristically measured expression, revealing little of his internal assessment. "Your community surprises me," he acknowledged quietly. "I expected more resistance to cooperation with people they have been taught to fear." "Fear often dissolves when replaced by practical purpose," Rebecca observed. "The horses provide tangible focus for cooperation that abstract peace discussions could never achieve." Chayton nodded appreciation of this insight. "You understand deeply for one not raised in our ways. Little wonder my brother finds such harmony walking beside you between worlds." The personal observation, coming from Lakota leader, typically focused on community concerns rather than individual relationships, suggested broader acceptance of connection developing between Rebecca and Wanbley. That Chayton would acknowledge this dimension publicly, even in private conversation, indicated significant evolution in his own perspective since their first encounter. "Your brother teaches me as much as I could possibly offer him," Rebecca replied with genuine humility. "Together, we learn to see through eyes shaped by different experiences, yet focused on shared horizon." "Well spoken," Chayton approved. "Such vision serves the difficult path you have chosen as bridge builders." He glanced toward where Wanbley approached from across the town square. "I depart tomorrow with our delegation, returning to prepare our people for changes these new agreements will bring, but I leave knowing my brother stands with worthy ally in the work ahead." Their conversation concluded as Wanbley joined them, the brothers exchanging private words in Lakota before Chayton departed to rejoin his warriors camped outside town limits. Rebecca and Wanbley walked slowly toward their office and adjoining living quarters, processing the evening's remarkable developments in companionable silence that required no immediate analysis or discussion. Only when they reached the privacy of their quarters did Wanbley speak on personal rather than official matters. "Seeing my brother and your community finding common purpose, however tentative, brings hope I had not expected to feel in my lifetime," he admitted, rare emotional openness showing through his typically composed exterior. "Hope remains essential, companion on difficult journeys," Rebecca replied, unconsciously echoing perspective she had acquired through their shared experiences. "Without it, obstacles appear insurmountable rather than merely challenging." "You speak increasingly with Lakota wisdom," Wanbley observed with gentle humor. "While I find myself thinking in patterns my people would consider remarkably wasikyu, perhaps we truly become the bridge we hope to build." The observation carried profound implications for their developing relationship, recognition that each had been fundamentally changed through their connection, incorporating aspects of the other's perspective while maintaining essential identity, rooted in their distinct origins. Such transformation represented not assimilation or surrender, but genuine integration of complementary wisdom that made each stronger through mutual influence. "The bridge stands stronger with 4 legs than 2, Rebecca quoted Zinkala's earlier observation. "When storms come, as they surely will, we shall brace each other against the wind." The reference to his mother's blessing brought rare, full smile to Wanbley's features. With characteristic directness, he closed remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his own. Then let us face coming storms together, not merely as territorial agents with common purpose, but as partners whose hearts recognize kindred spirits despite worlds that taught them separation. The declaration represented significant evolution in their relationship, moving from implicit understanding to explicit acknowledgement of connection that transcended professional collaboration. Rebecca found herself responding with matching clarity rather than conventional hesitation frontier society might have expected from woman in her position. "I would walk beside you in all aspects of the path ahead," she affirmed, squeezing his hands gently to emphasize commitment. These words represented, "Whatever challenges arise from either world, we bridge." Their commitment, though privately expressed in this moment, would inevitably face public scrutiny as their relationship became apparent to communities they served. Both recognized potential opposition their partnership would generate, from progressive settlers who supported their professional mission but would balk at personal connection that challenged racial boundaries, from traditional Lakota who accepted Wanbli's brother's diplomatic initiatives while potentially rejecting intimate relationship with Wasikyu woman, from territorial authorities who had granted their official positions without anticipating romantic dimension to their partnership. Yet in this moment of quiet affirmation, such external concerns seemed distant compared to certainty they had found in each other's company. The journey from wounded scout and isolated widow to territorial representatives and personal partners had unfolded through series of choices guided by shared principles rather than conventional expectations. Whatever challenges lay ahead would be navigated with same moral compass that had directed their path thus far. Dawn broke clear and crisp over Riverdale, sunrise painting the eastern sky with brilliant hues as Chaitan's delegation prepared for departure. The Lakota warriors had maintained dignified camp beyond town limits overnight, their presence generating curiosity rather than alarm as initial fears subsided into cautious coexistence. Now they assembled in formal formation for ceremonial departure, once again demonstrating cultural protocols rarely witnessed by settler communities. Rebecca and Wanbli attended this departure in their official capacity, joined by William Foster and several council members whose presence symbolized unprecedented recognition between communities typically separated by mutual suspicion. The collaborative spirit established through previous days' events continued as Chaitan formally accepted written documentation of agreements reached during evening discussions, promising to share these developments with wider Lakota community upon his return. To their encampment, "We plant seeds today that future generations may harvest," the Lakota leader observed as preparations concluded. Whether bitter or sweet fruit results depends on continued tending by those who understand value of growing together rather than apart. With these parting words, he led his warriors in departure ceremony that combined military precision with spiritual significance, riders moving in synchronized formation while elders sang traditional songs blessing path ahead. The Magnificent, her designated for joint management, followed behind under direction of selected herdsmen who would remain temporarily to assist with establishment of management structure agreed upon during council discussions. As Riverdale's representatives watched this impressive departure, Rebecca noted subtle transformation in community members' expressions, evolution from wary observation to respectful acknowledgement, perhaps even glimmers of genuine appreciation for cultural dignity displayed throughout Lakota delegations' brief presence. Such shifts represented precisely the gradual change in perspective she and Wanbli had hoped their work might eventually nurture, though neither had anticipated catalyst. As dramatic as Chaitan's ceremonial gift, remarkable developments in mere 24 hours, Foster observed quietly as they returned toward town center. When I awakened yesterday, joint management of anything between our communities seemed fantasy from storybooks rather than practical possibility. Sometimes dramatic gestures create openings where careful argument fails, Rebecca replied, reflecting wisdom gained through recent experiences. Chayton understood that abstract discussion of cooperation would face skepticism his horses could bypass through tangible demonstration of Lakota generosity and honor. Strategic leadership at its finest, Foster acknowledged, with bankers' appreciation for effective negotiation. I confess my own perspective has evolved considerably since Hayes's arrest and evidence you presented through Governor Thompson. Perhaps others can make similar journey given proper opportunity. The observation encapsulated core philosophy underlying Rebecca and Wanbley's approach to their territorial responsibilities. Belief that many people could evolve beyond inherited prejudices when presented with experiences contradicting simplistic narratives about cultural differences. Their work would focus on creating such opportunities systematically throughout territory, rather than expecting immediate transformation of deeply entrenched perspectives. As community members dispersed to resume daily activities, subtle indicators of changing atmosphere became apparent throughout Riverdale. Children approached the temporary corral where joint herd was currently maintained, their natural curiosity about magnificent animals overcoming cautions against interest in Indian horses their parents might previously have enforced. Several merchants engaged Lakota herdsmen in tentative conversation about potential trade opportunities once management structure became formalized. Even citizens who had opposed previous night's agreements watched proceedings with curiosity rather than open hostility, perhaps reassessing assumptions in light of peaceful interaction contradicting expectations of conflict. Rebecca and Wanbley returned to their office to document recent developments for official territorial records, their professional efficiency complemented by personal connection that made collaboration increasingly seamless. As they completed this, necessary administration, anticipation of challenges ahead, tempered satisfaction with progress already achieved. Hayes's associates remain active throughout the territory, Wanbley noted pragmatically. Initial goodwill established here represents beginning rather than completion of our work. And Riverdale remains single community among many where similar bridges must be built, Rebecca acknowledged. Governor Thompson's reforms face resistance from powerful interests that profited from previous arrangements. Yet, beneath these, realistic assessments ran current of cautious optimism neither would have articulated prior to recent developments. The transformation witnessed in Riverdale, however preliminary and potentially fragile, demonstrated possibility of genuine change when proper conditions aligned with determined effort to nurture understanding across artificial boundaries. That evening, as sunset painted western sky with colors rivaling dawn's brilliance, Rebecca found moment of quiet reflection on porch outside their quarters. From this vantage point, she could observe both town activities and distant prairie, where Chayton's delegation had departed hours earlier. Symbolic position between worlds she and Wanbley had committed to bridge through their unprecedented partnership. He joined her silently, his approach now familiar enough that no announcement was necessary. Together they watched days transition toward night, communities' rhythms shifting as work concluded and family gatherings commenced in homes throughout settlement. I received message from Fort Harrison while you were supervising herd arrangements. Wanbley mentioned after comfortable silence. Governor Thompson reports Hayes will stand trial next month for crimes documented in evidence we provided. Additional conspirators have been identified through financial records William Foster supplied. Justice progresses then, Rebecca acknowledged. Though both recognized judicial proceedings represented merely formal confirmation of accountability already established through their earlier efforts. And our work here begins establishing foundation. for something beyond mere absence of conflict. Foundation, Wanbley repeated thoughtfully. Good word for what grows between our peoples. Not complete structure, but essential beginning upon which more complex understanding might eventually rise. The metaphor applied equally to developing relationship between them personally. Foundation established through shared purpose and mutual respect, now evolving toward deeper connection that would require continued cultivation amidst inevitable challenges from both worlds they bridged. Neither needed to articulate this parallel directly, their understanding having progressed beyond requirement for explicit explanation of concepts both recognized intuitively. As stars emerged in deepening twilight, Rebecca found herself reflecting on a journey that had carried her from isolated widow, maintaining precarious independence, to territorial representative helping shape new relationship between divided peoples. The transformation seemed simultaneously gradual and sudden, series of choices, each following naturally from principles that had always guided her actions, yet culminating in life dramatically different from anything she might have anticipated. Tomorrow, we begin investigating documented incidents in outlying settlements, she noted, returning to practical considerations that would occupy coming weeks. Establishing pattern of prompt response to complaints will demonstrate seriousness of territorial commitment beyond symbolic appointments. Beginning with Taylor Creek Settlement, where Hayes's men reportedly forced Lakota family from traditional gathering grounds, Wanbley confirmed. Appropriate first case demonstrating commitment to address specific grievances rather than merely discussing general principles. Their professional planning flowed naturally, despite personal relationship developing alongside official responsibilities, balance achieved through shared commitment to mission that had brought them together. Initially, this integration of purpose across multiple dimensions represented strength rather than complication, allowing each aspect of their connection to reinforce rather than compete with others. Whatever challenges tomorrow brings, Rebecca observed, as darkness settled completely over Riverdale, we face them from stronger position than anyone might reasonably have expected so quickly after our appointment. The path reveals itself with each step, Wanbley replied, quoting perspective he had shared throughout their journey together. Our responsibility remains walking it with clear vision and steady purpose, regardless of obstacles that arise before us. As they retired for the evening, Rebecca carried awareness of extraordinary transition their lives had undergone since fateful night when Wounded Scout had appeared outside her homestead. The cabin that had represented her independence now existed only in memory, replaced by new beginning built on partnership stronger than isolated self-reliance she had previously valued. The community that had tolerated her unusual status as independent widow now witnessed her unprecedented role as bridge between cultures typically separated by mutual suspicion. Most significant transformation, however, remained internal rather than external. Evolution from survival defined by maintaining what remained of previous life to purpose focused on creating new possibilities that transcended artificial limitations imposed by either culture. In Wanbley, she had found a partner who understood this journey intimately, having traveled parallel path from scout caught between worlds to territorial representative, helping forge connections previously deemed impossible. As sleep claimed her consciousness, Rebecca's final thoughts centered not on past sacrifices, but future possibilities their unique partnership might nurture, both personally and for communities they served through official responsibilities. The 100 horses Chayton had brought represented more than ceremonial gift or practical resource. They symbolized potential for cooperation that might eventually transform territory's understanding of relationships possible between peoples, who chose recognition of shared humanity over artificial division. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, inevitable resistance from those invested in maintaining separation rather than building connection. Yet foundation established through recent developments provided framework for addressing such obstacles, with confidence born of demonstrated possibility rather than merely theoretical hope. Whatever storms might threaten bridges they constructed between divided worlds, they would face them together. As territorial representatives, cultural intermediaries, and personal partners whose connection transcended boundaries others considered impermeable. The path ahead remained uncertain, its eventual destination impossible to predict with confidence. Yet Rebecca Miller and Wanbley walked it with shared purpose and mutual strength that transformed uncertainty from threat to opportunity. Chance. To create something neither culture could have envisioned alone, bridge strong enough to unite worlds previously connected only through conflict and misunderstanding. 3 days later, as they completed investigation at Taylor Creek and prepared recommendations that would establish precedent for future cases throughout territory, Wanbley paused their work to share perspective that captured essence of journey they had undertaken together. "My people have saying," he observed quietly, "the longest road begins with single step, but becomes path only when others follow where first traveler walked alone." Rebecca considered this wisdom as they watched settlement children cautiously approaching Lakota family they had helped restore to traditional gathering grounds, curiosity gradually overcoming inherited suspicion as universal language of childhood. Transcended artificial boundaries adults had constructed between their peoples. "We may not witness road's completion," she acknowledged, "but perhaps our steps make path others will eventually follow toward destination we can only imagine." "That recognition," Wanbley replied with quiet certainty, "makes journey worthwhile, regardless of distance traveled in our lifetime." Together they continued preparations for return to Riverdale, where Joint Herd Management Council would hold inaugural meeting following day. Their unique partnership, professional, cultural and personal, had already catalyzed changes few would have believed possible mere weeks earlier. Whatever challenges awaited in territory's uncertain future, foundation established through their unprecedented connection would endure as testament to possibility of bridges strong enough to connect worlds previously divided by fear and misunderstanding. The 100 horses Chayton had brought with traditional ceremonial significance had transformed into something neither culture would have envisioned independently, symbol of cooperation that transcended boundaries while honoring distinct traditions that made each people unique. In similar fashion, Rebecca and Wanbley had become living embodiment of connection possible between worlds when artificial limitations gave way to recognition of shared humanity and purpose transcending cultural differences. Their journey continued, path revealing itself with each step taken in partnership stronger than either could have maintained alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.